On a small country road in Perthshire, there is this large pile of stones topped with a sturdy stone cross. There are hand-painted words on it that read "Maggie's Wall, burnt here 1657 as a witch." Rumour has it Maggie was one of the thousands of witches burnt at the stake. It's a place visited year-round by locals and visitors who are hoping to catch a glimpse of something creepy, perhaps the ghost of Maggie. But in reality, a tragic and horrific murder was committed right in front of Maggie's Wall, and the perpetrator is believed by many to have already stood trial for this crime. But because of a technicality, it's believed by many people that he got away scot-free. This is REDRUM, stories about the true victims of crime. I use news archives, documentary footage and books to research these cases, and so the episode's accurate to the source material I can find. You can find all episodes in podcast or YouTube form in the description box below. A lot of what I talk about today is alleged. It is likely to have happened, so much so that the prosecution talks about it at trial, or various victims speak out and report certain things to police. But a lot of it is not proven to the point of prosecution. I think it's probably still really worth mentioning here in terms of the trial and the result, and I'll get there, but just know that even though I'm not going to say alleged every single time, I will sometimes, just not every time. Just know that if I don't talk about it in terms of a verdict or sentence, then it is not proven. I don't usually do a little disclaimer like this at the beginning of each episode, but I think I need to in this case, purely because of the outcome. Now, unlike any other criminal court, Scotland has 3 possible verdicts in a trial. Guilty or not guilty, it's pretty standard, right? But they also have this third type, which is not proven. Nowadays, not proven is often used by a jury who believe that the defendant is guilty, but that the Crown hasn't provided sufficient evidence to prove that. I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but can you imagine just how frustrating this case is going to be? It was just after midday on the 10th of May 2019 that a couple were out doing some hiking on this sort of walking holiday. But as they looked out into the distance, they saw a figure sort of lying down. And as they got closer, it appeared that this figure was really still. And in fact, they were pretty sure that it looked like a person sleeping face down. But the person wasn't moving, and in fact it seemed completely unreasonable that a human would be in front of them. And so they kind of spoke about it and they convinced each other that it was some kind of mannequin. That was the most likely explanation. Someone had obviously dumped it by the roadside, but it could easily be mistaken for a human body. And one of the couple, who was holding a walking stick, got a little bit closer and decided to check if this was in fact a mannequin. And they sort of poked at what they thought was a mannequin with their stick, and they realised that of course it was a human body. After that, they called the police. The police soon arrived, and at first, seeing this body by the side of the road, they initially thought that it was probably the body of a victim of some kind of road accident. That was the most likely explanation. But after they called for an expert to come to the scene and examine the body, the expert turned the body over and found this large cut to the neck and extensive saturated blood staining to the front of the body. What was curious, however, was that there was no blood pooled in the sort of vegetation around where the body was found. This meant that the victim's death had not happened here. Her injuries had happened elsewhere and she'd been moved to this place. Not far from where that body was found was the famous Maggie's Wall witch monument, which I spoke about at the beginning. And as soon as that realisation was made by police, the case took a twisted turn. But before any kind of investigation could really be progressed, they needed to establish who the victim was. It turned out they had a missing persons report come in just a few hours earlier. It had come in from a 28-year-old man called Jordan Johnstone. Jordan told the operator that his sister, 22-year-old Annalise, was missing. She'd been living in this sort of council area in North Ayrshire in Scotland. Now, Annalise was an active member on social media, especially on Facebook, and she would often be uploading selfies, she'd be posting daily. A friend of hers noticed that she had not been active on Facebook, and this in itself was a sort of red flag. She thought it was odd in itself, and in fact thought it was odd enough that she did call Annalise's brother Jordan to see if he knew what was going on and where Annalise was at. Jordan explained that he hadn't seen Annalise since 3 a.m. He said he had dropped her off at their uncle's place and that she had said she was going to go hitchhiking. Annalise had a sister, Nadia, as well as this older brother Jordan. They were part of the travelling community. And back in 2019, Jordan had been unemployed, but he'd previously been making money working as a builder. Jordan's girlfriend, Angela Newland, had 4 children of her own, and she and Jordan had recently, unfortunately, lost their home. One of the children had left a tap running, and it had caused pretty bad flooding and extensive damage. Because of this, they ended up moving from place to place until eventually going to stay with Annalise, and that was at the beginning of May, so just a few days before Annalise went missing. During this period, oftentimes Angela would ask her parents to look after the 4 children if she was out seeking new housing or if she just needed to go out for sort of day-to-day errands. Angela would later say that Annalise had been upset on the afternoon of the 7th of May. She'd just spoken to her girlfriend on the phone and something, no one knows exactly what, had upset her. They decided that to cheer Annalise up, it would be a good idea to head into Glasgow. She said she hadn't been in a while and she quite fancied going. So they took this trip into Glasgow Centre. But partway through the day, Annalise became extremely anxious and she actually ended up cutting her arm in an act of self-harm as an effort to kind of get her brother to take her home. It was the very next day, on the 9th of May, at around lunchtime, that Annalise left her home and she headed out with her brother Jordan and Angela. And at 2 p.m, CCTV tracks Angela and Jordan together, and they sort of stop off at a shop at a local Sainsbury's in Stuart. This is around a 15-minute drive from Annalise's house. The next known movements of Annalise were just a couple of hours later, and she stops by this grocery shop called Alpine Stores, and she goes in just for a couple of minutes before coming out, and we know that this is just a couple of minutes away from her house. So she makes the short trip then to her house to pick up her dog Sadie, but she was only there for a couple of minutes, not very long at all. In fact, she picked up Sadie and immediately popped round the corner to her friend's house. She arrived at her friend and neighbour's house, Donna's house, and she told Donna that she needed to go out, she needed to do something with her brother Jordan, but that she wouldn't be long, maybe an hour or so, and asked if Donna would look after the dog. It seems to me that this wasn't out of the ordinary at all. It's likely that Annalise did believe she was going to be home that night. Certainly she wasn't going to be very long. And seeing as Donna volunteered often to look after Sadie, she figured she wouldn't mind this time. And she didn't. Donna agreed. She picked Sadie up and told Annalise she'd see her in a little while. Annalise knew that her neighbour, Donna, had to take her children to school the next morning, so said she wouldn't be late. It was during that visit to Donna's house, however, that she noticed when Annalise rolled up her sleeves that she had some self-harm marks. She decided not to say anything at the time, but she did note that it looked as though she'd gotten these quite recently and that they were very clearly self-inflicted. The night continued on for Donna as planned, but when Annalise didn't show back up at her house after an hour had passed, she began to wonder what was going on. She decided to check her phone, and that's when she saw a text message from Annalise saying that she was really sorry, but Jordan was taking a long time and she wouldn't be too much longer. Hours and hours passed by, and then at 11:45 p.m, Jordan, his girlfriend Angela, and Annalise arrive at Angela's parents' house. We know that Angela leaves her children with her parents quite often, and they were there at her parents' house. So they decided to pick them all up, got into this 7-seater car that was Angela's car. This was a little bit before midnight, and they decided that they were going to pick the kids up so that they could go and get some food from a nearby takeaway place. It was now just after midnight on the 10th of May, and the car is full of the sister and brother duo, his partner, and the 4 children. They visited a garage to fill up on petrol and then headed through to a nearby McDonald's where they collected their food. And then this This is where the story about what happened next gets a little bit fuzzy. What we do know for sure is that after Jordan called in to report his sister as missing, they brought him into the station and into an interview room to interview him as a potential witness in his sister's, at this point, disappearance. Jordan confirmed that the last time he'd seen Annalise was when he dropped her outside of their uncle's place sometime on the evening of the 9th of May. When asked why Annalise had gone to her uncle's, what was the point of her trip, Jordan said that she thought she might be able to find some drugs there. That's why she was going to see her uncle. Now, during that interview, where they're collecting information on Annalise's missing persons report, officers are informed that a body has just been found and they have an identity on that victim, and they were able to identify the victim from this very specific tattoo of hers. It was, of course, Annalise. Now, up until this point, Jordan's been pretty calm throughout the whole interview process, but then the officer turns to him and tells him that his sister has been found and she's dead. And he places his head in his hands and begins to shake uncontrollably. And at one point, he's actually slamming his head against the table, saying, "My head's fucked." It seems that after this, Jordan, who was obviously very emotional, left the police station and he headed home. Or at least that's what the officers thought he was doing. They continued to investigate Annalise's disappearance and now murder. And the first thing they needed to do was establish where Annalise had gone after she visited her uncle. But the problem was, when investigating officers spoke to Annalise's uncle, he said that he had never seen her that night. In fact, he didn't even live at the address Jordan had dropped her off at. Jordan had already told officers that he'd actually watched Annalise get out of the car, walk up to the building and go into the set of flats. It was only then, he said, that he'd driven off. Of course, Annalise's uncle confirmed that this never happened, and they did actually manage to corroborate that, and they determined that that was the real event. She'd never arrived at that place, she'd never gone inside. So now, of course, police believe that Jordan is lying, and they need to talk to him as soon as possible. It was 2:50 a.m. that following morning. The officers made their way to the place that Jordan was staying at. But when they arrived, they found that Jordan wasn't at home, no one was, and in fact there were signs that there had been some kind of disturbance. Thankfully, it wasn't long before they were able to track Jordan down to his partner's parents' house. When they arrived there, they brought both Jordan and his partner Angela into the station for further questioning. Both Jordan and Angela's stories matched from the very moment that they picked Annalise up, all the way through until they picked up that McDonald's a few hours later. Angela said that after that, the time was a little after midnight, and she and her 4 children were dropped off at a bus stop nearby so that they could walk home. Investigators looked into this and they determined that that walk could have been done without ever being captured on CCTV cameras. Angela said that the next morning she woke up, and when she checked her phone, she saw that she had a number of messages asking if she'd seen Annalise. But she hadn't. As far as she knew, Annalise and Jordan had driven on after dropping her and the kids off, and she didn't know where they'd gone to. But Jordan's version of events completely contradicted what Angela had said. He swore that he never dropped Angela off at the bus stop, and instead he said that they had all 7 of them, they had gone to drive up to Maggie's Wall. He'd stayed in the car with the children looking after them, and it was Angela who had been the one to head out that way with Annalise, both heading away from the car and out of view. When asked why they had gone off, Jordan said that Annalise had wanted to take some photos and Angela had agreed to go with her whilst he looked after the kids. Jordan said that a few minutes later, Angela got back into the car and she was alone, and that's when she burst open these 2 sachets of washing detergent and began to wash her hands with the liquid. Now, Jordan says that at this point he's just confused about where Annalise was, and so he gets out of the car and headed back towards the way that they had originally walked, and when he got there, he found Annalise lying on the ground. Quote, "I thought at first she'd been knocked out, so I've turned her round. I felt what I thought was water on my hand, but a couple of seconds later, I realised it was blood. It was bad. She was severely struggling to breathe, extremely gasping for air. By that time, I've got my t-shirt off and I've put pressure on it. I didn't know the wound was on her neck. Jordan claims that he then ran back to the car and screamed at Angela to call for an ambulance and then went back to Annalise. Quote, I went back to my sister thinking she is phoning an ambulance. I don't think she was even breathing at that point. My sister died in my arms. His story then continued with all of them heading back to Angela's parents' house. He said they both stripped naked outside of the door and then put all of their blood-stained clothes into a bin bag. Then they washed with bleach before taking a shower and then burying the knife in a Happy Box meal along with Annalise's glasses and her phone. When the police asked the obvious question why he'd done this, why he had helped Angela cover up the murder of his own sister, he simply stated that Angela had told him that if he didn't help her cover this up, she was going to accuse him of rape and abusing her children. He said that even if he wasn't convicted of that, he would be completely disowned by the traveller community and that he'd probably be killed himself. Quote, I didn't do harm to my sister, I didn't kill her. But of course, now police have two very different stories about what happened that night. And so they needed to look into other evidence that they could find from other outside sources. When Angela was questioned for a second time, she began to contradict what she had previously said. She said that Jordan had dropped her off, but not at a bus stop. This time it was at her parents' house. Of course, police are during this time constantly looking for outside evidence, and they do manage to find some CCTV footage from around 1:28 a.m. that morning. Now this footage shows Angela's car arriving at Maggie's Wall monument. This is under the understanding that Jordan is driving it. Now the next thing it picks up is that same car leaving the monument at 1:45 a.m. before returning just a minute later. And meanwhile, while that's all happening, over at Angela's parents' house, a neighbour said that they had woken up to the sound of the dogs barking at the house. She peeked out of the window, but she couldn't actually see anything because it was so dark. She could hear something though. She soon realised that she recognised the voice that she was hearing as Angela's. She also said that she heard the voice of another man, and she looked out to see who it was, but again it was too dark. She couldn't work out who that voice belonged to. Now this account, the neighbour's account, did give Angela an alibi, and even by Jordan's account, Annalise had died somewhere between 1:28 and 2 a.m. and CCTV had picked up Angela's car driving away from Maggie's Wall at 2:30 a.m. So if Angela was heard, her voice was heard at 2 a.m. at her mum's house, then she just could not have been at the crime scene when the murder took place. Even with this though, the police did keep digging. They weren't completely sure on who had been driving the car. Now a few hours later, we don't have the exact time, but sometime later that morning, a hotel worker saw Jordan at the side of the road. Now he was noticeable, and the hotel worker remembered him because he was burning some clothes. A DNA expert was called to trial eventually and said that she'd taken some samples near Maggie's Wall, and they came back as a match to Annalise, showing that was where she had probably been killed and then moved afterwards. That same expert also spoke on how they'd taken a DNA swab of Angela's car and found Annalise's DNA. They also analysed a swab from the boot of the car, and they found blood with DNA of Annalise and at least one other male person. The DNA expert said, quote, "This could be accounted for if wet blood from Annalise had been deposited on the ground and on the bumper and in the boot. In our opinion, it wasn't possible to determine if it was as a result of Annalise self-harming or from a cut injury to her throat. There was very little blood." The post-mortem found that that wound on Annalise's neck suggested that someone had repeatedly moved a knife back and forth a number of times. It also concluded that death would have happened in just a matter of minutes. Both Jordan and Angela were charged with Annalise's murder, and their trials began. Now, unsurprisingly, the pair broke up soon after their arrests and they turned on each other. There was some witness testimony brought in from Angela's new boyfriend. We're going to call him Tim. Now, Tim told the court that about a month after the murder, Angela had turned to him one day in bed and said that on the night of the murder, Jordan had turned up to her parents' house with her car and the front bumper was all bashed up. She said that Jordan said he'd hurt someone, but he never specified who. Angela said she helped him clean himself up and that they cleaned up their cells with bleach, burnt the clothes and got rid of a knife. And then Annalise's younger sister, Nadia, was called to trial. She said that she had previously had an argument with Jordan and Angela. This was just a few days before Annalise's murder. Angela had allegedly thrown a drink at her, and then Jordan had threatened to kill her with a knife. The pair then went on to push her over and also punch her. This argument apparently was all because Nadia had refused to give them the keys to her apartment. It's also alleged that Jordan assaulted Annalise just 2 days before the murder. The assault was that he had got hold of her and then forcefully pulled her out of Angela's car and onto the floor. We know that Jordan said that when he'd originally found Annalise face down at Maggie's wall, he'd sort of brought her up and shook her. He then eventually decided to move her body to where it would be found. There was no denying that he had moved Annalise's body. He'd admitted to that. But during the trial, it was heard that Jordan told his dad he had left Angela and Annalise alone at the monument, and then he had walked back to Angela's parents' house. He said that it was Angela who had later returned with the car and was covered in Annalise's blood. He apparently sprinted back to Maggie's wall where Annalise was, and that's when he found his sister. But this journey would have taken around 15 minutes, and he said that his sister was still alive when he found her. Something we know could not be true from what the pathologist said about death would have happened within minutes of the injury. Ultimately, Angela was acquitted of murder, and the judge ruled that there was simply insufficient evidence to convict her. Now, I spoke about this right at the beginning, about the fact that Scotland has these 3 possible verdicts at trial: guilty, not guilty, or not proven. And of course, that not proven verdict is often used by a jury when they believe the defendant is guilty, but the Crown just hasn't been able to prove that. In Scottish trials, you're required to provide corroboration. It is unique to Scots criminal law, and it means that facts presented, no matter how credible they are, they must have 2 independent sources of evidence in support, sort of to back them up. Of course, this is an incredibly effective tool in protecting against miscarriages of justice. But what happens if the crime happens in private? What about, for example, when there is a sexual assault or a domestic abuse case? The victim might be the only person who can say what had happened, so what then? I won't go into this in too much detail. I'll leave a link in the description box below, but I read about some development in recent case law around what can actually be considered corroborating evidence. One example is that a progression is that if someone has been accused of sexual assault in a workplace, for example, then if there's a number of different staff members who have said that these sexual assaults have happened, then they can corroborate each other in this way. That could be considered enough of a corroboration. Obviously, there are still gigantic flaws in that form of logic, but at least they are sort of moving towards changing case law. As I said, I'll leave a link in the description box below to some more reading on that if you're interested. I found it absolutely fascinating. I had no idea about that element of the law. Now back to Jordan, and he had admitted, of course, that he'd changed his appearance. He'd had blood-stained clothes that he'd then burnt. He'd buried the weapon. And in fact, the police did try and get him to take them to this weapon, and he did try, but in the end, it just couldn't be found for whatever reason. In the end, Jordan was discharged after a not proven verdict was returned. At the trial, Annalise's dad said that he had just given up all hope of the police doing anything about getting justice for his daughter. Quote, "I feel that if my daughter had come from a posh background, or if I was a doctor or something like that, the police would be going out of their way to keep this investigation running. But because she was a traveller, they've just moved on. It's like they just want to brush things under the carpet and get rid of it." The only sort of recent update from this case is that in July of 2024, this year, the Courier reported that there had been an update in the case. Now, they didn't seem to give any kind of details about what this was. It's reported as police possibly being on the verge of a breakthrough, but there's no specifics. Articles on this only talk about new pieces of evidence having been passed on to police and that it is being reviewed. So we don't know what this means. Will there be another trial for Annalise's murder? Are there any new witnesses who have come forward? Remember, they need corroboration. They need at least 2 independent sources. Perhaps someone knows something. Maybe someone saw something. Who knows? Detective Inspector William Murdoch said, quote, "The death of Annalise Johnson is considered an unresolved murder, and these cases are never closed by Police Scotland. Should any new information be received, detectives will thoroughly assess this and investigate further where necessary." So I guess all that's left to do is just wait and see. Unfortunately for Annalise, justice has not been done in her case. Oh my goodness, I have a great recommendation for you today. I went to see Don't Blink at the cinema recently. It's a new sort of psychological thriller. It's written by Zoe Kravitz and directed by her. And it's about this woman called Frida who happens to meet this guy who's this billionaire played by Channing Tatum. And he, in this like chance meeting, he ends up inviting her to his private island. And whilst they're there, they have just the best, most luxurious time. But then weird things start to happen. The women start to kind of forget stuff. I don't really want to go into too much detail because I don't want to spoil it. But I think this film was exceptional. It's rocketed to my top film of this year. 100%. Frida is played by this phenomenal British actor called Naomi Ackie, and her performance alone, it's just worth going for that. But it is a brilliant film, and if you do go and see it, let me know what you think. I'm desperate to talk about it. Other than that, I'll see you next week for another episode of REDRUM. Bye. Oh my goodness, also, I'm wearing REDRUM merch right now. The REDRUM store is open, it doesn't close. I order in every individual piece of merch and I pack it and I send it to you guys. I always write a little note. I'm so grateful if you've ever ordered merch from REDRUM, from me. If you ever plan to, even if you can't afford to or you don't want to, and you just shared it on your social medias or to other YouTubers, I really appreciate that. Same goes with the page. I see a lot of people recommending, I guess because I'm on the pages, and I just, every time it just makes me so happy. So thank you so much if you've ever recommended REDRUM, if you've ever bought the merch, if you've ever engaged in the comments even. Every single comment really, really helps, and every single like helps. Also, we have the podcast version of this. I think I say that at the beginning of every episode anyway, but if you are interested in having a listen as you walk around or go to work, or I mean, you don't have to walk, you do whatever you want, but if you are interested, I'll leave a link for that in the description box down below. That's it, that's all I've got. Okay, bye.